timely webinar, Genocide and the Widening Middle East Wars, presented by Massachusetts Peace Action and co-sponsored by the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, Historians for Peace and Democracy, and Brooklyn for Peace. My name is Terry Rockefeller. I'm a founding member of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, and also a board member of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. Tonight's webinar is being recorded so that our partners in Europe and Asia will be able to access it later. And if you have colleagues who are unable to join tonight, please let them know a recording will be available. The world has just marked the first anniversary of Hamas's unspeakable attacks, killing 1,200 Israelis and abducting more than 250 others. In the immediate aftermath of those attacks, the most personal, chilling moment for me was Netanyahu's declaration that October 7th was the worst terrorist attack the world has known since 9/11. But for Israel, proportionately, it was like 20 9/11s. As the sister of a 9/11 victim, I know all too well how terrorism engenders fear that leads to misgotten wars, the trammeling of international law, violation of human rights, and the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians. But the pace and scale with which war, destruction, and displacement, famine, and disease have spread throughout the Middle East in just 12 months has been truly alarming, right up to today's Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon and strikes on the capital of Syria. We are most fortunate to have three highly knowledgeable panelists here tonight to help us understand those events, consider what the future may hold, and what we can and must do as people committed to working for peace. Phyllis Bennis, Assaf Kfoury, and Ervand Abrahamian. Each of them will speak for 10 minutes, and I will introduce each more fully just before they speak. Then I'm going to have our panelists take about 10 minutes to pose questions to each other or comment on their initial remarks, and then we will open it up to your questions. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. And do not use the Q&A box for chatting. All right, to start us off then, Phyllis Bennis, who directs the Institute for Policy Studies' New Internationalism project. Phyllis was a founding member of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation and is a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She was on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace for years, and she now serves as its international advisor. Phyllis works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely in the US and around the world. Phyllis, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks to all the numerous organizers and organizations that have brought us together tonight. I'm glad to see so many working together at this urgent moment, this urgent year that we have been facing together with our Palestinian sisters and brothers. The context of today, I think, has a lot to do with history. History gets ignored too easily and ignored at our peril. And as we know, how history is taught, how history is learned, how history is reported, even in its initial reporting in the media, depends a lot on when you start the clock. And I'll give you a hint. If you start the clock on October 7th, your sense of history is not going to quite make it. So we have to be very clear that what happened on October 7th, parts of which were horrific violations of international law, some aspects of what happened were not in violation of international law, but none of it happened out of the blue. None of it just happened. All of it was rooted in depending on when you start the clock, on 16 years of Gaza being besieged, cut off from the world, kept sanctioned and isolated, whether it was 55 years since the occupation of the Palestinian territories, whether it was 75 years since the Nakba, whether it was 120 years since the beginning of colonial settlement in what became settler colonialism in what was then Palestine and what is now Israel and an unknown part of Palestine. So all of that is dependent on when you start the clock and whether you understand things in their context or not. The context we're looking at today that I think is very important is that this is a moment when there is a higher level of isolation of both Israel and the United States than we have seen in a very long time. We have the French president calling on the US, in fact, although others might be involved as well, but primarily on the US, to stop sending arms to Israel. We have the vote in the General Assembly of the UN, which was not on the question of genocide, but on an earlier decision of the International Court of Justice, finding in an advisory opinion requested by the General Assembly, finding that the entire settlement escapade in what is now Israel, the entire occupation is itself thoroughly illegal, must be ended immediately, and the settlers should be evacuated. That was the word of the judges of the International Court. The UN then voted in the General Assembly 124 to 14, overwhelming vote for implementation of that finding, which of course is not something that the General Assembly can just do by sending out its troops, because it doesn't have any troops. It doesn't even have a process server, for instance. What it does have is people like us around the world, civil society, social movements, who can use as a weapon in our fight the fact that the General Assembly of the United Nations has found this, in this case, this occupation to be illegal. In other resolutions that were passed, finding that what Israel is doing in Gaza is illegal, is a violation of international law, and must be ended. It's a tool for us, and an important one. If we look at the model of ending South African apartheid, it was resolutions of the General Assembly, which are widely dismissed as not being enforceable, that turned out to be very enforceable when they were used as tools by social movements. On the other hand, what we're looking at very clearly is that the United States is very directly enabling the genocide in Gaza. It is the irreplaceable force that is providing the weapons, the money to make the genocide possible. And right now we know that with the escalation, what is becoming a full-scale war, it seems they only acknowledge that something is a full-scale regional war if Israel is being the victim of some level of attack. The fact that Israel has been bombing this year Gaza, Lebanon, the West Bank, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the US, some of them as well, and also bombing Jordan. And now they're all talking about going after Iran. But we don't know yet if this is a regional war. I mean, if this is not a regional war, I'm not sure I want to know what a regional war looks like. In the United States, elite opinion, ruling class opinion is still divided. What they seem unified on is the question that we saw in an extraordinary line in the New York Times this morning in the print edition, I want you all to know, that the unified opinion is that the US cannot influence its junior partner, cannot influence Israel. None of them are prepared to say that it's not about they can't, it's about they won't. It's about a choice that, in this case, Joe Biden has made not to use US influence, which means stopping the weapons. The line in the Times this morning says, as the United States stands accused of complicity in what much of the world charges are Israeli war crimes in Gaza, the widening conflict has exposed, not for the first time, the inability of a great power to bend either recalcitrant allies or smaller adversaries to its will. The key word is inability, not unwillingness, not the lack of political will. So in the context of that division, that divided Washington, Biden certainly doesn't represent the majority of elite opinion on what is going on in Gaza exactly, although all want to support Israel, but not necessarily this much, not necessarily when the cost is not just Biden's own legacy that he will leave behind, which will not be the legacy of overcoming the threat of fascism in the United States, but will be spending this year making genocide possible, arming it, paying for it, hugging the perpetrator of it. So there's agreement, I would say, in US ruling class circles that Netanyahu is annoying, at least. But somehow Netanyahu and the right-wing forces, and this is clearly right-wing in the Israeli conflict, in the Israeli context, which means that we need to talk about extreme right-wing. This is the self-defined fascist element in Israel, which is now in power. They have managed to unite Republicans and Democrats in a position of finding Netanyahu annoying, but still wanting to escalate support for Israel because they somehow, living in their bubbles, have never broken with the understanding that they once had that criticizing Israel amounts to political suicide. It probably was never true. It certainly is not true today when 70% of Democrats and 61% of all voters want an end to the US sending arms. 70% of Democrats. That's never happened before. And yet, Netanyahu, as annoying as he is, still supports Donald Trump as a candidate. But the response of Democrats appears to be, we'll support Israel even more so that they can't use that against us. We have seen no change in the Democratic Party position, no change in the Biden administration's position, which is the operative position, beyond the rhetoric. Now, the rhetorical shift was important. We saw a shift from the first months of refusal to say the word genocide, still hasn't happened. We saw that same period, the refusal to say the word ceasefire. Then suddenly they started to realize the level of pressure that was coming from all the protests that were going on, the occupations in Congress, the occupation of the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations, the occupation of Grand Central Station.
2-minute warning.
Oh dear, okay. Then what we know is that there's been rhetorical pressure, but the Biden administration has not yet been prepared to change the policy at all, and that's what our job is. They're starting to admit a little bit. Matt Miller from the State Department the other day said, by the way, we've never wanted to see a diplomatic solution with Hamas. Now, there's a lot more to say, which I will leave for the question period. 10 minutes always goes faster than you think it will. But I want to say just a couple of things about our movement. Our movement has done two things, both of which I long thought was impossible. One was creating and following a level of message discipline that the Palestine rights movement was never known for. That's been amazing. The demand, ceasefire now, permanent ceasefire, immediate ceasefire now, is still the demand we need to hold on to. And the second thing we have done, we have managed to redefine what ceasefire looks like. So ceasefire no longer means just stop dropping the bombs, the US provided, US paid for, US produced bombs. Do that. That's number one. But ceasefire now means three things. Number one, stop killing people, stop bombing. Number two, allow in, encourage, and get in the massive amount of humanitarian aid that is required to stop an incredible level of death from famine and disease on top of the bombing, something that's going to last for a very long time. And third, stop sending the weapons. The US has sent $12.5 billion worth of arms directly to Israel so far this year. That amounts to 40% of Israel's entire military budget. On top of that, another $5 billion, that doesn't even count in that, of material, guns, bombs, planes that were taken directly from US stockpiles in the Middle East region. The US is now sending several more, a few more, they don't say numbers, 1,000 troops to the Middle East. That will make it somewhere between 43, 44, 45,000 troops in the region. And at a moment when there is a debate about whether or not Israel should launch a first strike, as if there had not been strikes already, against Iran, the US has made very clear that if Iran ever responded to such a thing, the US would come in on the side of Israel. So the question of US troops on the ground would be very much on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do know how quickly 10 minutes goes. Our next speaker is Assaf Kfoury, a Lebanese Palestinian-American mathematician, computer scientist, and political activist. He was raised in Beirut and Cairo and is a professor of computer science at Boston University. Working closely with Noam Chomsky for many years, Assaf assisted Noam when he went with and interviewed Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah and Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas, both of whom were executed just this year. His articles include Inside Lebanon, Journey to a Shattered Land with Noam and Carol Chomsky, and Hamas, From Candidate Enforcer to Implacable Foe. Assaf, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read my own notes. I was very careful to time myself to be within 12 minutes. So let me read. I'll start by contrasting how the same events are reported by Arabic language media outlets and how they are represented or misrepresented, or even entirely ignored by the US media. There are, of course, the outright double standards that permeate almost all reports of killings of Arabs in contrast to the killings of non-Arabs. The killings of Arabs are almost always in large approximate numbers, with very few identified by names or profession. The killings of non-Arabs are almost always in small exact numbers, most of them identified by names and professor or vocation. If Arabs get to be named, it is often because they are political leaders and their assassination are occasion for joyful celebration. This is what happened, for example, when Hassan Nasrallah was killed on September 27. The rejoicing by the highest American officials were duly reported in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other newspapers in the US, with not a single hint at the ongoing slaughter of Palestinians and now Lebanese too. Biden said the killing of Nasrallah provided, quote unquote, a measure of justice for Hezbollah's victims. He was referring to the US Embassy and the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut back in 1983. It was then echoed by Harris, who said Nasrallah was, quote, terrorist with American blood on his hands, end of quote. The hypocrisy couldn't be any more naked, as though Netanyahu, with unflinching US support, had kept his hands clean during the killing of tens of thousands of people in Gaza. None of this is lost on the Lebanese and the Palestinians, and the Israeli too, perhaps a scourge of the internet, which allows for immediate transmission of news across the planet. None of it is lost, as it breeds more resentment among Lebanese and Palestinians against the US, and it cheers on Netanyahu and his minister to pursue their campaign of manic violence and destruction. But there is another form of distortion in reporting events, more subtle and more insidious, with long-term pernicious effect. This is what Noam Chomsky calls manufacturing consent. So I'll give an example here. Take, for example, how the policies pursued by Israel in relation to Palestinian and Lebanese are reported by mainstream media outlets in the US. Maybe these policies are occasionally misguided or, quote unquote, over the top, according to Biden. But they are invariably justified as, quote, self-defense, end of quote, against an array of regional enemies who are said to be motivated by irrational hatred of Israel and the Jews. Underlying this justification, or in explicit defense of it, is how Israel is described in favorable terms, always ignoring or covering up some of its ugliest rotten aspects, like the ongoing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank pursued by the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Israel is said to be, quote, our strongest ally in the Middle East, and, or, quote, a democracy sharing our values, or a democracy constantly under attack, etc. I mean, I want to quote Thomas Friedman, who had these words just a couple of weeks ago. It's a country up against a regional superpower, Iran, that has managed to put Israel into a vice grip using its allies and proxies, end of quote. The proxies being Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, and various armed groups in Iraq. In such mainstream accounts, Israel is never described as a proxy state, never as a surrogate state, and not even a state beholden to the US, even though the US has provided more economic and military aid to Israel than to any other country since 1949. This is some of the points that Phyllis has been referring to. Israel is almost always depicted as a state that makes its own decisions, occasionally in consultation with the US, but this consultation is never described as meddling. This is not a case of outright hypocrisy in reporting, but whitewashing and obfuscation under a veneer of objectivity, intentional or not, of the reality of Israel policies and its relation to the US. By contrast, I'm reading these things from the Arabic press. None of Israel's Arab neighbors see it that way. And these include not only the common people and the masses, but also the autocrats and absolute monarchs. Both autocratic Arab rulers and Arab masses view the state of Israel as an enforcer of American power in the Middle East. This is a reality that the former, the autocrats, accept and even welcome, though not too openly and not with equal enthusiasm, while the latter, the masses, resent it. They all hear and read about it or witness it directly via the Israeli sledgehammer, like the Palestinian and now the Lebanese too. But they draw diametrically opposed conclusions. Autocratic Arab rulers aspire to become members of US-led alliances, also accepting that they will never achieve among US allies the same standing as Israel, which had been assured of American largesse and support since its founding in 1948. Israel is and will remain the top dog in such alliances. For example, it now operates the F-35, the most advanced fighter jet in the US arsenal, while the Arab autocrats have to content themselves with the less advanced fighter jets, such as the F-16. At the other end of the political spectrum, Arab masses don't really care about US-led alliances. They're opposed to them, which they commonly perceive as a continuation of a long history of colonialism and exploitation stretching back all the way to the 19th century, if not to an earlier period. Whereas Arab autocrats aspire to conclude agreement with Israel under American guidance and blessing, such were the Camp David Accords, for example, or more recently, the Abraham Accords. The Arab masses, on the other hand, spontaneously identify with Palestinian suffering and want to volunteer to help them out. The contrast, it is really a deep charge between American expectation and Arab perception, especially at the popular level, sometimes has catastrophic consequences on how politicians conduct their affairs. This total disconnect is reflected, for example, by the article that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan submitted to Foreign Affairs magazine on October 2, 5 days before October 7. In it, he claimed that the Middle East, quote, is quieter than it has been for decades, end of quote. And that, quote, we have de-escalated crisis in Gaza, end of quote. That article was submitted 5 days before October 7 and coincidentally produced a written record and testimony of the utterly myopic and delusional views of the handful of people responsible for setting American foreign policy. Popular and flattering Arab perception of the US, the West, and Israel are often attributed to, I quote some paper article I read, myth of victimhood and exploitation, end of quote, which are said to be promoted by propaganda or by truncated or biased education in autocratic Arab regime. In fact, there is no need for propaganda and no need for truncated education in a region that has experienced devastating wars every few years. No history books and no re-education camps are necessary to teach common people that Israel has been a watchdog for the US and the West in general. These devastating wars, which Israel spearheaded or participated in since 1948 have occurred 3 or 4 or 5 years or more within every generation. I can go through that list. We can go through that list. It's really every 3, 4 years that Israel has been engaged in some kind of a campaign penetrating Arab land in Lebanon, and then go all the way back. Gaza, more recently, Gaza has suffered every 4 years an operation, and sometimes not the proportions are like 1,000, 2,000 people killed for one soldier or something like that. I can go back to 1921. 2021, 2014, 2009, and all the way we can go back.
2-minute warning. 2-minute warning.
All right, thank you. 3 days ago, I've been translating some of the pieces that I've been reading from people commentator in Palestinian and Lebanese. So here, 3 days ago, a prominent historian and her own blog, Israel proxy wars are not new, nor are they impossible in the case of Iran. This is not the first time that Israel has assumed the role of a reserve army to overthrow regime hostile to the West in the Middle East. This role, which is renewed depending on the needs of each geopolitical era, is the solid basis of Israel's affiliation with NATO and its organic relationship with the United States. And what it gains in return in terms of financial and military support and direct military protection when necessary. This was Israel's role in opposing the Arab National Liberation Movement throughout the Cold War. It was militarily manifested we're going way back, in the tripartite aggression against Egypt in 1956. This was, again, Israel's role in 1967. The Egyptian army defeat at the hands of the Israeli army benefited the United States and its allies, which culminated in toppling the Nasser regime and eventually reoriented Egypt toward an alliance with the US and Israel. In both wars, it is worth recalling that the Israeli government was led by the Labour Party, a member of the Socialist International. It was not led by the extreme right Likud party. Since the beginning of the Iranian nuclear crisis, Israel has been threatening to strike nuclear facilities and has already carried out cyber attacks and assassination. I better stop here. I'm looking at my own clock here, but there is more information I could bring up in relation to my comparison between what is being written in Arabic. Commentators, Lebanese, Palestinians, and some others, some in the papers in Beirut itself, some still being published in the West Bank, and some in that are based now in London because they cannot operate openly in any of the Arab countries. So I'll stop right here.
Thank you so much, Assaf. Our final presenter is Ervand Abrahamian, an Iranian-American historian of the Middle East. He's a distinguished professor of history at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and widely regarded as one of the leading historians of modern Iran. He has also taught at Oxford, Columbia, New York, and Princeton universities. His many books include, and I am only naming a few, Iran Between Two Revolutions, Radical Islam, the Iranian Mujahideen, and the Iranian Revolution Turns 30. Ervand, I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. The obvious question that comes to mind, I think most people are asking in this present crisis, is clearly that, Netanyahu is eager to get Iran involved and therefore bring United States in it. The question then obviously is, what is Iran's response going to be? How is Iran going to be basically countering this? Now, to understand that, I think you have to go back to history and look at how Iran has behaved in the past in foreign policy. Often in the media, also in elite circles in America, Iran has been easily demonized. And it's easy to demonize Iran because actually its internal policies internal, the systematic, basic way how it's dealt with dissent has been despicable. Much more despicable, actually, than people realize in the West. But there's always this slippage that if a country is despicable internally, it must be despicable abroad. And you can get frequent cases in history where that doesn't apply. You can have a country that has a despicable internal policies, but externally completely good, cautious, and I would say rational policies. I won't give too many examples, but Stalin is one to look at. Stalin's internal policies in the 30s were, of course, despicable, especially with the purges, but his foreign policy, I stress on collective security, it was very rational, and if other countries had pursued that, there would have been, in fact, no World War II. And in the Iranian case, if you look at how it's behaved since the revolution, it actually fits very well into the American sort of conservative international relations theories such as Merkheimer, that it's a highly rational, I would say not only rational, but a highly cautious foreign policy. So often in the abroad, especially with Netanyahu, Iran is considered an existential threat because it's led by one man who is obsessed about basically the end of the world, the return of the Messiah, and therefore is concerned, eager to get a nuclear bomb, and this would, of course, hasten the end of the world, and so on. So that's the sort of rhetoric that people often work on when they look at Iran's foreign policy. But actually, if you look at how Iran has behaved since the revolution, on the whole, there are certain exceptions, often on the ground, not from the state, but from popular movements such as the taking over the embassy and the hostage crisis. But on the political level, these decisions have been often hammered out, not by one man, but actually a National Security Council, where there are people from all the sectors of Iranian institutions that are involved, have a stake in foreign policy, they have an input. And what you get is, in fact, quite a systematic, consistent foreign policy. And I would say not only rational, but cautious. And over the years, the problems actually have come much more from the West. And the only if you can go through all basically the administrations, whether it's the Bush, the Clinton, the present administration, they are the ones that have been the problem. One exception was Obama, but I'll get to that in a moment. But the Obama case, where there was a reach out and willing to negotiate. But from the beginning, Iran was willing to actually hold out an olive branch to the United States. And give you some examples. When the US invaded Afghanistan and had trouble actually forming a government, it was Iran that stepped in and used its as allies, especially what was called the Northern Alliance and the Shia groups in in Afghanistan, to be able to create the Karzai government. And in fact, the US at that time was thankful about that. Then soon after that, actually, Iran sent a message to Bush. It was called basically a grand deal where all the issues would be discussed and negotiated. They were willing to, in fact, discuss everything that was there, including the Palestinian issue. The Bush administration was absolutely not interested, because at that time they were more interested in regime change, not in negotiations. So the Swiss basically delegate who was bringing in the grand bargain was reprimanded by the Bush administration and told never ever again come back with such a proposal. This was like as a sort of a naughty boy. The Swiss were bringing a message that the administration didn't want. And you can go along with different lines, different periods where Iran was willing to negotiate. Their one line was that one issue they were not willing to negotiate was the right to have enrichment of uranium, but they were always willing to put restrictions, verifiable restrictions that could be observed, and that nuclear enrichment program would not become a nuclear weapons program. And what you find throughout the American administrations was they were not willing to negotiate. What they really wanted was, they said they would put pressure, sanctions pressure, more and more sanctions pressure. And they said this would bring Iran to negotiations. But what they really wanted was regime change. They knew that Iran would never move on the question of giving up all nuclear right to nuclear enrichment. But if you pressured that on Iran, that this is what you have to give up, obviously they're not going to give up. Sanctions would remain. And their hope was eventually there would be an overthrow of the regime and the regime change. Of course, it was an old type of politics of coup d'etat. The new terminology was regime change. The Israelis went even further than that. Actually, you find influential people in Israel drawing up maps of Iran that Iran no longer existed. It was divided up into small ethnic groups. And you have influential Israeli politicians talking about how Turkish-speaking Iranians, Azeris, are basically dying to be unified with their brothers and sisters in northern Azerbaijan. What they wanted was a dismembering of Iran. So there's much talk in Iran abroad that how Iran was out to destroy Israel, but in fact, the Israeli policy was actually to destroy Iran. The Iranian policy, in fact, on Israel is interesting. You do have people like Ahmadinejad talking a lot of nonsense about the Holocaust never existed and so on, having conferences. But you get also what is not much looked at is even conservative presidents in Iran or liberal presidents like Khatami. They openly said, they were quite willing to accept a two-state solution to the issue if it was okay with the Palestinians.
2-minute warning. 2-minute warning.
Okay, so the question becomes, what will Iran do now with the pressure? I would say, looking at what they did before, they will, in fact, be very rational, cautious. Everything is on their side. As Phyllis has said, world opinion, U.S. and Israel are now being called genocidal or supportive genocidal. Countries like South Africa, Turkey are taking Israel to high courts on genocide, the crimes against humanity. So they can sit back and look at enjoy the scene that other people are saying what they've been saying for a long time, that Israel is not interested in negotiations. Israel is an expansionist power, will never give up territory. Also, what I think in their interest is to keep out of actually military involvement, because in time, in fact, they can build up their own strength. In 10, 15 years' time, they will be much more militarily stronger than at present to be able to actually challenge Israel. So on many grounds, I think I would predict that they will not actually react strongly, because it's not their interest. But of course, Netanyahu is so eager to do it, either at the end of this administration or under Trump. And the question is, how is he going to do it? He can bomb Iran. He can try to bomb the nuclear sites, but that's not going to do much effort, actually, because they're dug way deep down. And bombing Iran is not going to destroy the regime. In fact, from, again, historical cases, what unifies people most is some outside power and coming and bombing the population. Even people who are critical of the government in Iran will rally around the government once bombs start being dropped on Tehran or other cities. Thank you.
Thank you to all our presenters. I'm now going to give you an opportunity to maybe make additional comments in light of the other people who spoke, or to pose a question, or
Well, I have a question for Ervand, because I'm sure Ervand has noticed that the new president, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Pezeshkian,
Yes.
He made an overture to the U.S. in his speech at the UN, and I read it. I did not listen, and none of the officials in the United States tried to take advantage of that or say something. They didn't even say this is just a facade or something. They didn't mention it. Was totally ignored. What's your view of that? Is that then you, Ervand?
Yeah, it's like the past, but they loved. In fact, I think Netanyahu and the Likud said they loved Ahmadinejad because he was talking a lot of nonsense about the Holocaust. How can you talk with him? Well, there were other people like the Rafsanjani, the president, Khatami, the president, previous some former presidents who actually were willing to negotiate on everything, including Palestine. So they select what they want in order to demonize and make the argument that really Iran is not a country you can really negotiate with. And it's interesting because Obama was the first person in the White House who said, no, broke that. And because he broke that, Netanyahu did everything to undermine his position, including basically campaigning for Romney. And then after Obama is elected, he did everything to undermine Biden's nuclear negotiations. What is not actually often dealt with is what was Biden's position in this. Biden is so proud that he was a Zionist. Does that mean he was such a Zionist that he was willing to go against his own president? He was, after all, the vice president. What did he do or say when Netanyahu is in Washington, basically bad-mouthing Obama? That would be an interesting topic to investigate, because it's hard to have any self-respect for a vice president at that time who had no self-respect for himself.
There's an interesting question about that. And I was also curious, Ervand, if you have a sense of how much power the new president, who ran and won on a more or less reformist, moderate kind of position in the Iranian elections, how much power he has relative to that of the supreme leader. But just on the question of Biden's role, one of the aspects of that was that before the negotiations had even begun on the Iran nuclear deal, on the JCPOA, in 2010, when Biden had been sent to the Middle East, the day he arrived, Netanyahu's government announced a new set of, I think it was 20,000 new settlement units that were going to be built, that had just been given permits. And it was seen as a major insult, a major slap in the face to Biden, who bit his lip, didn't say a word about it. Later, Obama mentioned it as something that had been clearly designed to, it was a slap in the face to the US. But Biden had not responded at the time that he was there. My recollection is that he was a supporter of the JCPOA. that he was one of the, he wasn't one of the negotiators, but that he was supportive of the process with Iran. But I don't know whether at the point after it was, when the question was when he became president, he talked about wanting to go back into negotiations for the JCPOA to return to it, but then dropped that. There's the propaganda about it was, well, Congress wouldn't have allowed it, which may or may not have been true, but there was no evidence that Biden made any effort towards it. But I'm curious what you think about the power of the new president in Iran to have more influence than some of the past presidents have had on major decisions about war and peace, among other things.
Well, it's a good question. The policy, foreign policy, is made actually in the National Security Council. The supreme, he's not a supreme leader, he's a leader, actually. It's the Western translation to become supreme. He's the leader, but he signs off after listening to all the different arguments. So decisions are made there. The president plays a pretty important role, but so does the Foreign Office, there's the other institutions. So even, with Ahmadinejad, when he was, grandstanding about the Holocaust, there were negotiations between Iran and the Obama administration quarterly in Oman. So there, the president, I don't know if Ahmadinejad was aware of it, but policy was made basically by the National Security Council. Mm-hmm. So now it's actually a better situation because the president also is publicly known and got elected on a much more basically opening up policy. So they can't say, well, the president is not is interested, but other people are not interested. It's the decisions, the messages really come with a larger council, and the councils, if it has to have support of the leader rather than just the president.
Thanks.
But going back to actually when Biden came in, yes, he promised that a return, but in fact, what they did is they kept all the sanctions and basically said, we continue, we'll get a better bargain. So it wasn't going back to Obama. They said we will get a better bargain. They expected either the regime to collapse or to come down and beg for something else. And I think there's a story within that one of the negotiators was then basically forced out. They did an Oppenheimer on him. They took away his security clearance, so he couldn't really negotiate. But I would love to have an interview with him to see what was really going on in their supposedly committee that was supposed to negotiate. But it was clearly that Obama was not really interested in going back to that Biden was not interested in going back to the Obama deal, which was, I think, a historic deal. It was
that seems very clear that Biden had no intention. He had made certain commitments when he was running, and he maintained some of those commitments as statements when he first took office. That included returning to the Iran nuclear deal and a better deal. It was both. The way he talked about it, we would first go back to the deal and then get a better deal. But he also made commitments about changing or challenging Trump's position on Israel and Palestine. Trump, of course, had changed a number of policy issues that he could do without congressional approval. So the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, recognition of a unified Jerusalem as the unified capital of Israel only, recognition of the annexation of the Golan Heights as legal, saying that the settlements were legitimate and legal, and that further annexation in the West Bank would be acceptable to the U.S. It was a whole series of acceptance of the most extreme positions from the Israeli government. And it was in that context that I think we saw, in a sense, Biden, the Zionist, having made the statements all along through his campaign, I don't agree with those positions. Those are not my positions. I will change those positions, and then not changing them. The only one he ever changed, he never allowed to reopen the consulate in East Jerusalem, never reopened the PLO office in Washington. The only thing he ever did was allow the Secretary of State to make a kind of weird statement about settlements, going back to the old language about not helpful. But none of the others did he touch. So those are Biden's positions now. Biden's legacy positions are the embassy belongs in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. All of these extremist positions that he rejected as a candidate and as a newly installed president are now his positions because he never did anything to stop them. So there is that history from what you were asking about Biden's position.
So his policy is actually further away from Obama's and much closer to Trump.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. One of the big questions, of course, will be whether Kamala Harris's positions are closer to Obama's or closer to Trump. And there's all of that is reading tea leaves. It's reading tone of voice and that sort of thing, because her official positions are lockstep with Biden so far.
There is a point that I'd like to add, this mixed with what has been said so far. So Israel has bombarded Damascus today. And one thing that Assad in Syria has done, you may have followed that, he has closed the Houthis of Yemen, had the Yemen embassy in Damascus. He told them to go out from that. He doesn't want the Houthis to be there. And he did it with the blessing of the UAE, United Arab Emirates. Now he's doing this. Look how this is happening. So Assad is very close, he's supported, has been supported by Iran. He has asked the Houthis, who are closer to Iran than they are to Saudi Arabia, to get out. And he's bringing back to that embassy the people that are close to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Nonetheless, Israel decided to bombard Syria today. So you have that kind of a situation where the Saudi and the United Arab Emirates are upset at the way Israel is disrupting some of the things they'd like to accomplish. They would like to draw Assad into their orbits and to take him away from Iran. This is not helping what they're doing today. Netanyahu decided to bombard Damascus. So there are these things that he has been doing, Netanyahu, and this also relates to some of the other issues that were brought up. Apparently, this is what we are being told, that the ceasefire plan that the US and France had sent to Nasrallah 2-3 days before he was killed was approved by Netanyahu himself. Nonetheless, he decided to kill him. It's a bit like what he did with Ismail Haniyeh.
His lead negotiator, yeah.
He was there, and he approved that plan, and nonetheless, he went and killed him. So it's a bit of that situation where he seems to be acting, on the one hand, he seems to go or say whatever the United States would like to say. But on the other hand, he is acting like a loose cannon on the deck, and he goes whatever he wants to do. So
I'm gonna open this up a little bit more. We've had a record turnout, way over 250 people, and there are questions that are coming in. So I'm going to ask Joseph Gerson, the Executive Director of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and Prasannan Parthasarathi, who's a professor of history at Boston College, a member of Mass Peace Action's board, and on the steering committee of Historians for Peace and Democracy, to field some questions to our panelists. Turning it over to the two of you who have been going through our audience questions.
I'm going to kick it off actually with the question of my own before I turn to the questions that have been coming in through the chat or the Q&A. This is a question for Ervand. Could you say a little bit more about why Obama followed such a different policy vis-a-vis Iran? And is there anything that we can learn from that? Are there any lessons for the peace movement today?
Yes, actually, it's very revealing. He came to the conclusion, I think, a realistic conclusion, that you either go and have a war with Iran or you make a compromise. And as if you can get a compromise where you can guarantee Iran will not go nuclear weapons, but give the concession that Iran can have enrichment, limited enrichment under control, then that would avoid a war. And that was his conclusion. And he'd also come to the conclusion that mounting pressure, sanctions is not going to bring down the regime. Okay. So I think from that, it was easy to come to that conclusion. So we're back to square one. There is no Obama agreement. The situation is still there. The alternative is either war or eventually, if there's no agreement about the nuclear weapons, Iran has a good, actually rational reason to go for a bomb in the long run. So the situation actually is very drastic. Iran does not have a bomb now, but once it's started being bombed, and this was often stated in Washington, then they'll have an incentive to actually use all their facilities to build a bomb. Then you're getting in a different ball game.
So I'll jump in here. There's lots of questions that we want to go to, but I have a question of my own as well. Also for Ervand, in the U.S. press, what we read about is Iranian control of what's happening in Lebanon, of the Houthis, of Hamas. How should we understand Iran's relations with these countries?
Well, the word proxy gives it away. It's the idea somehow these are proxies of Iran. It's a very different situation. Iran, when the revolution succeeded, the expectation was that the Iranian revolution would spread throughout the Middle East. It would become a world revolution, the idea of, Lenin in 1917 and stuff. It didn't happen because the Iranian revolution was very much an Iranian revolution with the language of Shiism. This language of Shiism did not resonate outside the Shia world. So you have enclaves of communities that are besieged in their own states by larger, bit more powerful groups. They are besieged at the question of, in fact, of survival. For instance, in Syria, the main slogan of the so-called freedom fighters was Christians to Lebanon, Alavis to the grave. Okay, so if you're an Alavi, what are you going to do? Go to the grave? You have a rally around Assad. So the Alawi community in Syria had a vested interest to actually look at Iran as a protector. Similarly, you find in Iraq, it wasn't Iran that extended into Iraq. It was the United States that broke Iraq. And in that chaos, Shia groups formed their own militias, and they felt threatened, so they looked for Iran for assistance. So they basically looked at Iran as a protector. Houthis were, again, their own had that conflict with Yemen, as they belong to Zaidi, which is a very sort of offshoot of Islam. It wasn't considered Shia until recently. They didn't know they were Shias. Iranian Shias didn't know the Zaidis were really Shias. But because they felt threatened against especially Saudi Arabia that was supporting jihadists in Yemen, they looked for Iran. Again, we know from WikiLeaks, actually, that Iran advised the Houthis not to go to Sinai, not to take the capital. The Houthis made their own decision. They went into Sinai and basically then looked for Iran for support. So I would say these are not proxies, but very much independent groups that have their own interests, and they look for Iran for help, assistance.
Can I just add? Oh, sorry.
And it's not actually, they say, well, Iran is spending billions of dollars on these so-called proxies. Actually, it doesn't, I'm sure it doesn't cost Iran that much to finance militias, especially in Syria. Most of the militias are actually poor Afghanis who are recruited, given a wage salary for a private to be in Syria. So it's not a sort of a large empire expending its arms from the Mediterranean to India. It's small groups under siege, under life and death threat, looking at Iran for support.
If I could just add one point to that I think is important, particularly vis-a-vis Hamas and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, historically has been probably the closest to Iran politically, and gotten some support. But both of them, both Hamas and Hezbollah, emerged in the context of fighting against Israeli occupation. Hamas emerged in the context of the first Intifada in 1987, 1988, in that period, and of course got support from the Israelis for a long time because they were seen as being more malleable, less dangerous than the secular nationalism of the PLO. And similarly, with Hezbollah, they emerged in the context of the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon that went on for 18 years that only ended in 1990. So, in those periods, it was very clear that whatever support they may have gotten or still get from Iran, their origins were very national. They were very much in the context of fighting against a foreign occupation by Israel, and got a lot of popular support where they were for that fight.
In Lebanon, in fact, Hezbollah didn't exist until Israel invaded Lebanon, and as a reaction to that, that was created. And there was a lot of free play with history, blaming Nasrallah and Hezbollah for the bombing of the American embassy. In fact, Hezbollah historically didn't exist at that time. So maybe Nasrallah was a secret member of some group who was involved, but Hezbollah didn't exist for Nasrallah to be head of Hezbollah, to have masterminded the Barak bombings.
Yeah, can I add a couple of comments? Yeah, some of the things that Ervand and Phyllis I wanted to say. Well, officially, Hezbollah came into existence in 1985 by a letter that was kind of primitive, not very sophisticated, and then they had a 2009 manifesto that was the current manifesto, which was very different. We can say this kind of the same thing about Hamas, but the other thing that was mentioned, I think, by Ervand, is that these groups have a large degree of autonomy. Something that is happening, for example, with Hezbollah, you can go into their town. You can see, you can walk into a home that belongs to a Hezbollah person, and you will see, for example, a photograph of Che Guevara. All right? And you will have a photograph of some of the Latin American people they like next to Nasrallah. I don't think that will happen soon. This is more difficult to see in Tehran. Another thing that you can find also in many places in Lebanon, in the south, you would have, you go into in one of the small villages, and you see people that don't wear the hijab. They are dressed the way they dress, like in Dearborn, because many of them are related to people in Dearborn in Michigan. And they speak perfect English also. And they still are related to these people. And nobody is telling them, get out of here. They're totally comfortable. Another thing that has been pointed out, they've never closed a bookstore. Hezbollah never closed a bookstore for the kind of books it sells in Lebanon. The other thing that gives you a certain sense of the differences, and I would watch the hanging in Tehran of people that were caught because they were part of the gay movement or something. The gay movement is very strong in Beirut. I mean, it's there, and nobody is, even in the section that where the Shia are a majority. So you have this situation where locally at least, these people function and act in a totally different way from the way the images that are being transmitted. I can say the same thing, by the way. I mean, I was in Gaza in 2012 on a trip with Noam Chomsky was part of that trip. Not to the same extent as in Beirut, but you could go into Gaza and walk into places that were like offices that belong to Hamas. And you get a sense that they have their own customs. It's more conservative than Beirut. Yes, it's far more conservative. But that idea that, for example, I mean, the idea that a woman will not shake hands with a man, well, that's not the case. It's not the case. I mean, one can go into these places, the woman will shake hands with a man, even though she has the hijab. And the same thing can happen also in Beirut. You can have that. In Beirut, you have this mix of people that goes against the way the situation is being presented in the United States newspaper. There's a lot of things one can add to that, but I'll stop here.
Can I modify a question that was put through the Q&A and presented to our panelists? Especially Phyllis, maybe can comment on this, which is none of the panelists mentioned AIPAC. Do Democrats, you gave the 70% figure that 70% of Democrats favor an end of US arms shipments. Is that enough to neutralize AIPAC?
It's not enough to change the policy. AIPAC is not the only ones involved here. AIPAC is not making the policy. AIPAC is one very strong actor. There's a ton of others. The Christian Zionist movements, Kufi, are probably as powerful or more than AIPAC. But no, it's not enough, because one of the big splits that exists right now in the Democratic Party is the divide between the Democratic Party base, which is increasingly more people of color, younger people, more active, progressive wings in many different places, Palestinian and Arab and Muslim constituencies, progressive Jewish constituencies. It's much more diverse. And there's a huge divide between the base of the party and the electeds. So the 70% figure is of the base of the party, Democratic Party voters, not Democratic Party members of Congress. So far, there's only 17 members of Congress, including the House and the Senate, who support some kind of a cutoff or conditioning of military support to Israel. That's tiny relative to where the base is. But much of the base doesn't have the money of the big lobby groups, including AIPAC, not only, but including them. So money talks. The biggest job for any member of Congress is to win the next election. Every 2 years, they have to raise money to run again. And that becomes a very major part of how they make their decisions about what they are going to vote on issues that they decide are not important enough to their particular constituency where they happen to be. That might be, I'm going to vote with the people who pay me because I need their money to run again, because there are 5 other issues that are very important to me and are important to my district that I want to be able to vote the right way. And so I'm going to do this, and I'm going to vote the wrong way. Maybe I don't even believe it. Maybe I do, but not very much. Maybe I don't believe it at all, but I don't think it's that important to people in my district. The people who in my district who send me money and people out of my district who send me money think that I should vote that way. So I'm going to do that because I don't think it's the most important. It's a very tough thing to compete with. So the quick answer is no, it's not enough. That's why we have to do better. And this is really complicated. The movement that has sprung up, partly based on the existing Palestinian rights movement that has existed for the last 20, 25 years, and has grown and has had a real impact on popular discourse, on media coverage. As bad as it is now, it has been so much better than it ever was 4 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's night and day. I mean, it's not funny, but it's shocking when we see young people coming into the movement now who are still stunned at how bad the mainstream media coverage is. And it's important to remind them how it used to be, not because it's a question of, look what the old guard did. It's because it shows that movements work. Movements can change things. And one of the things we can change is public discourse and the narrative of the majority of people in this country. What we haven't been able to do yet is get to the next step. You know, we've changed dramatically the public narrative. We've changed significantly, not as dramatically, but significantly, we've changed the media coverage. We're just barely beginning on the policy side. And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's the part that matters, because we can have all the discourse change we want. We can have all the media change we want. But until it gets to the policy level, the genocide of Gaza will continue. So that's the challenge, using inside and outside targets. We have to do it all. We have to keep doing everything we've been doing and be more creative. This movement has been, the part that has just emerged over this last year has been extraordinary in the level of creativity, in the discipline on messaging, the willingness to come out again and again and again, every week, every day, every week, every month, and keep doing it. That's been amazing. And we need to be very grateful to the spontaneous part of that movement that has emerged so spectacularly over this year. And we have to do more. We have to help figure out more strategic approaches, whether it's inside strategies of, who is in the room with Biden, who might have a different approach and might be able to get a word in. Can we get the Pope to say something? Biden is an ardent Catholic. He takes seriously what the Pope says. If the Pope called him, what would that mean? All of these things, anybody who has access to anybody on the inside needs to use that. And the outside part, the protests, the occupations, the resignations. It's extraordinary. In my history in movements, going back to Vietnam, I don't remember ever seeing this number of people in government signing open letters, criticizing the policy. Ultimately, there's now, I think, more than 25 or so who have resigned publicly. They now have a website. They're like a whole organization, the former officials of the Biden administration. And you had 1,000 people at USAID, 500 people at the State Department, 700 people, I think it was, who work for Congress. My personal favorite was the White House interns. These are kids, they're high school kids, and they are the most ambitious kids in the country. They all want to be president, right? And yet they were willing to take the risk and come out and say, Mr. President, we're not the leaders of today, but we aspire to be leaders tomorrow. We need a better example than what you're giving us. This is extraordinary. This has never happened before. And it's not yet enough. So we need to keep doing it, and we need to do it more and better.
So I will say that with 50-some questions, it's a challenge to keep up with them and to sort through. So I'm going to, I remember a question, I'm not going to find it precisely here. And so the question is, how is what has now become, as Phyllis said in the beginning, a wider regional war, how does this impact the emergence of the difficult emergence of a multipolar world, of the changing global order, the geopolitical order? And maybe to ask each of you to comment on that.
Well, I'll say one thing first, which has to do with international law. I think what the model of what South Africa has done at the International Court of Justice has been a transformative change, even beyond its significance at potentially bringing about an end to the genocide in Gaza, as important as that is. And that is, it challenged the taboo on countries of the global South taking any initiative in institutions that were created by and theoretically for the white colonials, frankly. The Europeans, the North Americans, Australia, New Zealand, that's who gets to use things like the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. Those are not institutions that are supposed to belong to countries of the South. And South Africa said, you know what? We're not buying it. We belong there. We have an initiative and we're going to take it. And the court, to their credit, took it seriously. The overwhelming majority of the court, including the one US judge, voting unanimously, near unanimously. There was that one judge from Uganda that nobody can figure out that voted against everything. But if you take her out of the equation, it was virtually unanimous across the board on these on these calls that were not just the initial, although this is still the temporary finding that it is plausibly genocidal, but it also is evidence of the ability of a whole bunch of different countries to use the court to challenge power, to challenge powerful nations, to challenge the allies of the most powerful countries. And now we have the example in the UN the UN General Assembly of passing resolutions calling for the implementation and enforcement of those decisions. So I think that challenge to what international law looks like, and what we see is the fight back from led by the United States, but some Europeans as well, saying, we're not going to talk about international law. We're going to talk about something called the International Rules-Based Order. Iran is violating the rules-based order. Well, excuse me, what rules exactly are we talking about? Because, you can disagree about interpretations of international law or whatever, but it exists. It's written down. It's in a book. You can read it. It says, you shall not do X. No country may do Y. There is no such thing as the international rules-based order. It's whatever Biden says it is at any given moment, or whatever Macron says it is at any given moment. That doesn't mean anything. It has no legitimacy. That's what they're using to try to undermine the reality of international law as the basis for how the world works. And I think we're beginning to see a pushback against that and the reclaiming of international law through the use of these institutions, the possibility that the International Criminal Court will actually issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his people. That was never imagined at the time of the Rome Treaty being signed in 1999. They never thought about it being used this way, but it is. The same with the International Court of Justice. So this gives me some hope here for what a unipolar world's end could lead into. It's not going to be a perfect multipolar world. Most of the poles are not so great, but it's what we've got. And that possibility, I think, is more real right now than it's been for a long time.
There have been a couple of questions about oil that have come through the Q&A. It's kind of surprising, I think, to a number of people in the audience that we have a webinar on the Middle East and oil has not been mentioned at all. How does that figure into what's going on right now?
You can ask, why is it back in 1973, the oil played a big role in the confrontation between Israel and Egypt? And if you remember, if it weren't for the oil embargo, it would not have started the process that led eventually into the Camp David Accord at the end of the 70s, right? Well, I'm not going to, there are many different situations here that have happened since this is 50 years ago. I mean, you can ask the question, is oil can play the same role as it played in 1973 after the October War? I mean, think also of the situation where right now the people who are controlling the oil, who are on like places like UAE, United Arab Emirates, or the Qatar or Saudi Arabia, how they position themselves with respect to the United States and Israel. I think most of us here, maybe, I suppose, have read that article about a week ago where Blinken is meeting with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, in Saudi Arabia, and MBS tells Blinken, I don't care about the Palestinians. I don't know if you caught that. It was, and then of course, someone later would say, no, MBS did not say that. They can't report it because it will be very bad for his own audience. But that was an interesting article mentioning to what extent they are ready to get involved with Israel, and they want to be in the same club with Israel. And he told Blinken, this is a very interesting article, it was in the Atlantic, where he tells him, Blinken asked him, are you ready to do that? And then MBS tells him, you will have to have 6 months of calm in Gaza. The Israelis should not go in, because they would go periodically and bombard and do something there. They have this expression, mowing the lawn. They go destroy the place, get out, and they do it periodically. So MBS tells Blinken, if you can tell me that for 6 months they will hold back, there's a period of calm, then I'll be ready to go in and do something. And then also in that context, he mentioned, I have to be careful, if you read the article, he estimated that 70% of his own public, the way he put it, they're younger than I am, and these people are in support of the Palestinian. So if I do something that would be in support of an agreement with Israel, I have to be careful myself. I mean, he goes into something, I'm not sure it's entirely correct. This is the person who wrote the article. I'm thinking of what happened to Sadat when he went into the Camp David, and within a year or two, he was killed. And I have to be careful. And he was saying that some of his advisors were telling MBS that he shouldn't go into that now, as with the situation in Gaza. The situation is a bit different right now than it was in '73. And my sense, I mean, I'm sure Ervand and Phyllis have something to say on that, is that the Gulf states and those who are controlling the oil production don't care that much about the Palestinian. They'll be ready to get rid of them or something. And they're not ready to play that the oil card. It's not there.
Oil may not be openly discussed, but I think back of people's minds, there is that concern with oil, because if Netanyahu does manage to get Iran involved, one of the Iran strategies would be actually to hit the oil targets and will close Hormuz. And I know U.S. produces a lot of gas and oil, but the problem, even the disruptions there would drastically escalate the price of oil. And that would have easy repercussions on the American election. So this might be something that actually Netanyahu is thinking about. If he wants to actually destroy Harris, one way is another incentive for him would be to escalate the crisis with Iran, because that would remove Harris and then bring in Trump. That would then secure Netanyahu's policies.
On the question of foreign intervention in the U.S. election process, I think maybe we have time for one more question here. I want to conflate two of them. There was a question about the role of the student protest in creating increasingly the discourse to frame the understanding here in the United States, and then another one about the level of opposition now, the repression on college campuses and otherwise. I mean, I have a friend who teaches here in the Boston area, a physicist, who is concerned about what he can do or say in relationship to Palestine. So I'd be curious to hear, maybe primarily from Phyllis and Assaf, what you are hearing in terms of new directions for the movement.
Yeah, certainly the students have played the extraordinary role, as has happened in so many movements before, both here and around the world, of really reshaping a movement that was already expanding and growing and acting out a number of ways across the country. And suddenly the explosion of student mobilization that began really at its height in the spring of last year with the encampments, certainly at Columbia, but in so many places, met by incredible levels of violence by police. At UCLA, police standing by and allowing a group of self-identified Zionists to come in and attack them. you know, and students have paid a huge price. The threat, particularly to foreign students who risk being expelled from the country if they are suspended from their school requirements. So there's been a huge escalation in repression that began a few years ago with the effort, which is still underway, to criminalize the BDS movement. It's part of this process of weaponizing false claims of anti-Semitism to claim that criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic, that the rise in real anti-Semitism, which is underway in the United States, real violent anti-Semitism, that comes out of the right wing, that comes out of white supremacy. That's the origins of this round of anti-Semitism going back to the 1920s for the last 100 years. And instead, to keep the attention not on that, but keep the attention on the solidarity movement with Palestinian lives, the movement for Palestinian rights, the movement to stop the arming of the Israeli forces committing genocide. And we know what happened with ending up with the firing of administrators, the threats to fire and some firing of faculty members, and students paying a huge price. So the question is now, as students are just back the last couple of weeks, and already we saw around this anniversary, we saw a number of protests on a number of campuses. I think in most places, the notion of encampments is less likely, partly because in some places they've been explicitly prohibited, and it's probably not the most useful challenge to put a lot of time into challenging that particular rule when there's so many other creative ways of having public protest that's visible, that allows ways for students to meet with each other. What was so incredible about the encampments was not even the visibility of it, which was huge, the flags, the banners, the excitement about it, but also what they were doing in those encampments. They were having teach-ins on a daily basis. Young people that had never really thought much about Palestinian rights, about who were the Palestinians, suddenly were interested in it and were getting a real education in these teach-ins. The Jewish kids that were having Passover seders last spring in the middle of Passover in these encampments and inviting in all of the others to participate with it. All of this has been an extraordinary reminder to those of us who are older than students of what student creativity can lead to. So I think the question now is, what's going to be the next stage? I think there's no question that the students are coming back mobilized, organized, ready to move. The election has made things more interesting and more complicated, for sure. The uncommitted movement challenged people in a whole new way of balancing political commitments of various sorts. Never easy, and amazingly creative, powerful, thoughtful work by the leadership of that movement to figure out how to navigate through the primary process and then beyond. What happened at the DNC, you know, when the Democratic Party had a clear moment when they could have won back so many people who had said, I cannot imagine voting for this party when they are supporting genocide. And they reduced and reduced and reduced what they were demanding of the DNC until finally it was simply give one Palestinian American the right to speak on the main stage. And they said, no, not going to do it. And then what happens next? So the challenges are out there. This is a very complicated time. Having this debate, having this mobilization in the immediate run-up to the election makes everything more complicated. So I give all credit to these student organizers who have been working so hard through the summer, and now I've been meeting with some of them, and they are amazing. Meeting with the leadership of the uncommitted movement to figure out their next steps and how does that fit with the student movements. So I think we're up for another season of protest with a even more sophisticated and more educated group of activists, not only the students, certainly the other organizations. The Rabbis for Ceasefire are one of the organizations being honored day after tomorrow at our annual Human Rights Awards that the Institute for Policy Studies does, along with IMEU that many of you know. And this is unprecedented to have a pro-Palestinian organizations, in this case, the group of rabbis, hundreds of them now, that have been out there protesting the US support for genocide. That's been an extraordinary part of this movement. So what we're seeing with the students is the leadership of it, and it's bringing with them a whole bunch of other people so that this big, broad movement is going to continue and become even stronger, because we still have not stopped the genocide, and that's our first job.
So it's my really sorry responsibility to kind of bring us to a close here. You know, we've covered a lot, and at the same time, there's so much more to cover. And I think we're all looking forward to continuing conversations. I think out of kindness for our speakers and for those of you who maybe haven't had dinner yet, we need to bring it to a close. My hope was, and much as Phyllis was just saying now, my hope was that tonight's program would not simply be analytical, but would lay foundations and provide inspirations for everyone listening here, and those we'll share the video with, to take action. We need to win the ceasefires. We need to win the negotiations over time that can lead to healing, to justice, and something like maybe someday peace, and to stop the killing. I mean, most immediately to stop the killing. Cole Harrison, I'm hoping, can find a way to post a link that people watching can see, ways that you can contact your members of Congress and senators. If not, when we send out the thank you to all of you, we'll have a link so that you can take that fairly simple action. And then I just want to close with a deep appreciation for our speakers, for Terry Rockefeller, who chaired this, for our co-sponsoring organizations, and for Cole Harrison, who has been at the controls here, and who just very thankfully gave us a link here that you can build from. I can also add that you can get a lawn sign that looks not unlike this, that you can put out on your lawn if you have a lawn, or in your window. Ways in which we can continue to break the silence, to build movement, and to stop the killing, win the ceasefire, and move toward a just peace. Thank you very much, and thanks again to our speakers.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, it was good. Terry, you're
I wanted to thank all the participants, all the speakers. It was an honor to chair.
Just to say, my memory, and we're seeing it now, is that even as we're done, we have now 144 people still listening. So some of the conversations may need to be taken offline.
I'm going to set the example of leaving. Bye, everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you.